Podcast. My name is Alex. I'm your host and founder of Legacy Football, and today I'm going to be doing a tier list, specifically on which AFC offenses I think are going to be the best in fantasy this upcoming season. Since this is before the draft, I want to make a quick disclaimer. We're only going to be talking about the players on the current roster. So a team like New England, who you would expect is going to be taking a quarterback at 3, because they don't currently have a quarterback at 3, we're going to consider that a massive red flag. So just to kind of get that out of the way, I know there's obviously going to be a lot of teams that, in theory, will move up in the tier list after the draft, just because they will address a lot of their needs. But for the time being, they haven't, so they don't. All right. I'll also be doing another one of these on the NFC as well in the future, probably tomorrow, but we'll kind of see how content goes. All right, so we're going to start out with the Buffalo Bills. Well, the Buffalo Bills lost Gabe Davis. He went to Jacksonville, signed that 3-year, $55 million contract. If you're looking at the offense after Joe Brady took over as the offensive coordinator, Stephon Diggs had a massive drop in production. I would imagine that they will find a way to remedy that if he is still on the team. Like I said, we're taking it as is, so in this case, he is still on the team. So we're going to evaluate it like he is. So I would say that Stephon Diggs is definitely going to see a better amount of targets. He's going to have a better role in the offense than he did at the end of the season. You still have Josh Allen, who's the QB1, and I wouldn't imagine that changing. He's shown year in and year out that his rushing ability and his rushing touchdown ability, as well as that cannon of an arm, have definitely put him in that number one spot. If you look at a guy like James Cook had a bigger role in the offense that second half of the season with Joe Brady, so I would imagine that will stay true as well. You would also expect to have a big jump from Dalton Kincaid in his second season, and Dawson Knox is still a quality tight end as well. Khalil Shakir showed flashes, so I would imagine that Gabe Davis being gone, in my opinion, that's an upgrade in terms of the targets that you're getting, because Gabe Davis is somebody that's so inconsistent that you can't rely on him weekly, whereas if Khalil Shakir is getting that target volume, I would imagine he's going to be a much safer bet to produce weekly. So for me, with all that being said, I still think Buffalo needs another receiver alongside of Stephon Diggs and Khalil Shakir. But I think their overall offense is quality enough to be able to put them in the A tier. Now the Bengals. The Bengals to me are a very similar situation, although since they still have T. Higgins at the moment, I would say that the Bengals still have a better offense than the Bills. That might be a hot take. I know there's probably going to be a lot of Buffalo fans trying to throw me through a table after saying that. But you have a bona fide top 2, top 3 receiver in Jamar Chase. You have a bona fide top 24 guy in T. Higgins. Joe Burrow, when healthy, of course, we're using that as a disclaimer because you would imagine that he's going to be healthy going into the season. He's a top 3 to 5 QB. Even though he doesn't give you much with his rushing ability, he's still somebody that can throw for 4,500 yards and 40 touchdowns. That's not out of the realm of possibilities. So I think he's close enough to Josh Allen, but the receiving core that the Bengals have is definitely better than the receiving core the Bills have. At running back, they obviously lost Joe Mixon. They signed Zach Moss. They still have Chase Brown. In my opinion, I think Chase Brown is going to be the guy, and I would imagine that Zach Moss will be getting a lot of that in the trench work, probably a lot of inside the 5 carries on both sides of the field if the Bengals are ever backed up. But in my opinion, Chase Brown just offers more as a player, as a playmaker. You saw he has great receiving ability. He has big home run play ability. I would say that, that offense in general, I was always a big Irv Smith fan, so I was really hoping he was going to pan out for them last season. He didn't. Mike Gesicki just signed with the Bengals, so I would imagine that they're going to be upgrading at tight end as well. With all that being said, I'm putting the Bengals in the S tier. Now the Patriots. Well, like I said in the earlier part of the video, I'm not going to be judging it based on the fact that I assume they're going to be taking a quarterback. Right now, Bailey Zappi, not an NFL starter. You look at the running back room. I love Ramondre. I think that's the only real shining light on their team right now, on offense. He was banged up at the end of last season. He obviously didn't play the last month or so. I would imagine that when he does come back healthy, he will be that workhorse. He will be that guy that you can believe in again. A weekly low-end RB1, weekly high-end RB2, even with a poor situation at quarterback. Once again, assume they would draft a rookie, assume that would change. But at the moment, it's not. So I'm evaluating it as if it is Bailey Zappi. Their receiving core, they just signed KJ Osborne. To me, KJ is not a number one receiver. I think KJ could be a high-end 3, very, very low-end 2 on an NFL team. Not fantasy-wise, but on an NFL team. I think if KJ Osborne's your third best receiver, I think you're probably in good spot. I think if he's your second best receiver, you better have an elite number 1. Because if you're going to be targeting somebody like KJ 10 times a game, I don't think you're going to get the production that those targets would really demand. I do think Demario Douglas is one of my sleepers of the year. I think he came on midway through the season, battled some injuries himself, but when he was on the field, you could see that he was talented. I don't think he's the number one receiver either, so I think that they're going to have to address that in this class. Maybe take somebody in the second round. They have an early second round pick, so they would have to address that either way. And this class is obviously a very deep wide receiver class. So I would assume that they'll be able to get that position figured out. But at the moment, their receiving core is very weak. I like the fact that they re-signed Kayshon Boutte, but he's never been a productive guy in his NFL career so far. He's talented, but just hasn't put it together. Maybe that's Mac Jones. Maybe that's Bailey Zappi. Maybe that's the fact that Matt Patricia was his OC at one point. Either way, hasn't proved it, hasn't shown it. Then at tight end, Hunter Henry is a great red zone look, but he's not the same guy that he was when he was on the Chargers. And that guy wasn't even an elite tight end. So I would say that he's probably your low-end tight end 1 streaming style tight end. So all that being said, bottom of the barrel for me. Jacksonville. The thing with Jacksonville is, on paper, I think they're a better team than they are actually in practice. So, to start out with the running game, Travis Etienne, I loved him coming out of Clemson. I liked him more than Najee, honestly, as a prospect. Obviously, he missed that first year with the Liz Frank injury, but from a talent perspective, I thought he was an every down kind of guy. He had great receiving chops, great burst, great speed. I think he's an underrated runner, but when you look at his production over the last month of the season, and you look at his total carries relative to his total yardage, he had the 4th most carries with the 11th most yards and the 7th most touchdowns. If he stays inefficient, I don't think he's as good of a fantasy player as where his ADP is. I think you can find other players in that same range where Etienne's getting drafted that have similar upside without the potential of having a very inefficient and ineffective play. When you look at the receiving core, they are the ones that obviously signed Gabe Davis. Gabe Davis to me is way too hit or miss, way too boom or bust. When you look at somebody like Trevor Lawrence that needs to have a consistent option, I think you have Christian Kirk, who obviously 2 years ago showed that he was a very, very, very good player. I think in Arizona he was never really given that opportunity to become what he obviously became when he was in Jacksonville that first year. Last year obviously had the injuries, but I would say that Christian Kirk being their number one receiver isn't a bad thing, but I would hope that they would address the receiver position as well. Zay Jones, not really anything to discount or not anything really to promote. I think he's for lack of a better word, he's a jag, right? A jag on the Jags, just another guy. I think he has similar receiving ability to what Calvin Ridley had when you look at what they can do from a scheme perspective. So I think maybe losing Ridley maybe promotes Zay a little bit more. Zay's had good moments in the NFL. There's no doubt about that. But do I think he can be a weekly contributor on an offense that desperately needs weapons? That's still to be seen. And I think that's why they went after Gabe Davis. But like I said, Gabe Davis is way too boomer bust for me to really feel confident that he's going to be that guy. So for me, and then obviously you got to talk about Evan Ingram. Evan Ingram at the tight end position is right there smack dab in the middle of your tight end 1 rankings. I think most places have him about 6 or 7. I have him a little bit lower than that, but that's just because I like a lot of the younger guys a little bit more. So I would say for me, Jacksonville's going to be kind of smack dab right in the middle of that C tier. I think they have the upside because if Trevor Lawrence can actually seize his potential, if Gabe Davis maybe becomes a more consistent option than he was in Buffalo, then maybe I'm totally wrong on Gabe Davis. But for the most part, I would say that I don't believe in Jacksonville's receiving core. I think Tank Bigsby will probably be taking over a lot more of that short line, that short yardage situation in Jacksonville. And I think ETN, as much as I loved him as a prospect, I don't think his NFL career has really shown yet that he can be an elite running back. I think he's a really good running back. I still think he's a low-end RB1, high-end RB2. And if you look at the production, obviously he was a top 5 running back last year. But if you look at the way that he finished the season and you looked at how inefficient he was, and you would just imagine that Doug Peterson, with his injury history, you would just imagine that he's going to want to alleviate that workload. So if ETN is still going to be inefficient and eventually lose carries and goal line touches, then I just don't see an opportunity for ETN to really be an elite option. All right, Kansas City, the reigning Super Bowl champs. This one, to me, if I was ranking it from a team perspective, it's obviously an S tier. When you're looking at it from an offense perspective, you have to start with Pat Mahomes. And Pat Mahomes is elite. When you look at his production this past year, if you think about all the Kadarius Toney drops and all the Kadarius Toney interceptions, the MVS drops on the big plays, that really impacts his fantasy production. You know, there's easily probably 4 or 5 more touchdowns that he would have scored had he not had, Travis Kelce led the league in drops as well. So from a receiving core perspective, they had way too many drops, not really utilizing and maximizing Pat Mahomes' ability as a player. And then obviously the interceptions that came as a result of a Kadarius Toney batted ball or, just a bobble. It's one of those things that I would imagine that his fantasy production will align more with what we have seen rather than what we saw last year. I know for the most part of the year last year, Pat Mahomes was not a good fantasy quarterback. And the NFL quarterback is just a true straight-up winner. Yeah, he's obviously going to produce and he's obviously going to get wins. That Kansas City defense helped a lot from that perspective. But I would say overall, if you're looking at him, I think he will be better than he was last year, especially with the signing of Marquise Brown. Hollywood is somebody that can take the top off the defense, similar to an MVS, but much more talented in my opinion. If you look at the quarterback options that Hollywood has had, he had Lamar, who he obviously had a 1,000-yard receiving season with, the only receiver that Lamar's ever had a 1,000-yard receiving season with. Then he had Kyler, but you never really got to see him and Kyler in full action outside of the short stretch where DeAndre Hopkins was suspended 2 years ago. And then obviously Kyler got hurt. Obviously, Marquise missed some time. So I think if you're putting a huge playmaker with Pat Mahomes, I think you have your wide receiver 1 on that team. I know a lot of people like Rashee Rice. I don't have anything against him. He played incredibly last season. And especially for that being such a stacked receiving class last year with the Pukas, the Jordan Addisons, the JSNs. I think Rashee Rice obviously showed a lot that Pat in his rookie year. So I would imagine that he will take a step forward Kadarius Toney's still on the team, but I would imagine that he's going to be much more of a gadget guy than a receiver. Maybe have him more on those end around, those sweeps. Really not a downfield option as much, just because of his inability to show that he deserved that target volume that he got last year. Isaiah Pacheco, to me, even though you look at the draft capital, and obviously draft capital when it comes to the NFL is a big proponent in how long a guy gets to have that starting job, I think Isaiah Pacheco is one of the best runners in the NFL. You obviously see the memes and the videos if he's angry at the ground, just running, stomping his way. But I think he is a talented enough running back on a high-powered enough offense to where he can be a weekly starter. He's not always going to offer RB1 production just because of how much they throw the ball, especially when they get close to the goal line. But I think he has enough ability as a runner to get you 15, 17 carries a game, and also probably get you 2 or 3 catches, or at least 2 or 3 targets. So for me, I think Isaiah Pacheco is still a great running back option. And then obviously Travis Kelce, the tight end 1 for the last 6 years, 7 years. I think if you're looking at his production last year, I think it was obviously a massive drop-off. He was 4 yards away from 1,000, and he didn't have as many touchdowns as he typically does. But I still think that Travis Kelce showed you in the playoffs that he can still be that guy. So I think overall, they still have an elite offense. I think now with the Hollywood Brown addition, they're going to get back to what they are. And I know that production last year didn't look as good, but they still won the Super Bowl, and they're still dangerous. I don't care who your receiving options are. Pat Mahomes is still that dude. So in my opinion, Kansas City belongs right up with the Bengals as one of the best fantasy offenses in the AFC. And then speaking of fantasy offenses in the AFC, especially the elite ones, where do you even begin with a team that put 70 on the Broncos? Tua obviously is the biggest question mark on that team. I had him in a couple leagues last year, and he was a roller coaster. 1 week he'd get you 28, 1 week he'd get you 14. Next week he'd get you 18, week after that he'd get you 7. So from his value perspective, I'm going to be out on Tua in a lot of leagues. Even though I think that they have the best number 1 and number 2 receiver in the NFL in Tyreek and Waddle, I still don't trust Tua's ability. He doesn't give you anything in the running game. He doesn't give you any rushing touchdowns. He is a beautiful thrower of the ball. And even though he underthrows a lot of those deep shots to Tyreek, Tyreek is still an elite enough receiver to be able to come down with those and make big plays out of it. So I think he still has value. But for me, after being a little bit jaded and seeing him last season, I think I'm going to be out on drafting Tua this year. When you look at the running backs, obviously Raheem Mostert had an incredible season, especially when you're looking at where he was drafted. The value you got if you had Raheem Mostert on your team, getting 20 touchdowns from a guy that was probably drafted after the 10th round in most leagues, I think you are looking at somebody that you would hope would have that kind of production and will probably be drafted higher as a result of it. But to me, I think that's more of an outlier season. I think if Devon Achane hadn't been hurt for the first month of the season and then came back for 2, maybe 3 games and then got hurt again for another month or so, he went on the PUP list at one point, or the short-term IR, I'm sorry. I think that will definitely be a running back room to watch this season. I know, me personally, I'm huge on Devon Achane. I think he offers you elite upside that no other running back can really offer you. You saw it a little bit with Keaton Mitchell last year, but Devon Achane can take anything to the house. It doesn't matter how long it is. It doesn't matter how tough it is. He's shifty enough. He's elite. He's explosive enough. He's fast enough. That entire Miami team is obviously a track team. But I think if you're looking at it from a running back perspective, I think Devon Achane is going to be somebody that they get more involved. So I think the workload will obviously be split up a little bit more between him and Raheem. So Raheem, I would imagine, is obviously going to have a regression season where he comes back to maybe not what he was in San Francisco, where he wasn't. I mean, I know a lot of his issues have been injuries. When Raheem Mostert's been on the field, he's been a great option, but he's dealt with his own injuries as well. So he had a fully healthy season this year, and I'm happy for him. So I don't, obviously, I'm not expecting and I'm not projecting that he will get hurt, but I would imagine that they will diversify that workload a little bit more, probably closer to an even split. Both of the running backs are great in the pass game, so that short area dump off to be able to take it to the house. Both of them have that kind of speed. Obviously, Achan's younger and faster, but Raheem Mostert's no slouch when it comes to that. When you look at the receiving core, like I mentioned, I think that they're the best receiving core from a duo perspective in the NFL. Obviously, there's plenty of other receiving cores that you can look at and make that same argument for. But in my opinion, I think Jalen Waddle is criminally underrated. But last season, it kind of showed. It kind of showed why he is criminally underrated at times. Because he was hurt. He wasn't producing when he was on the field. A lot of the volume obviously was going to Tyreek. Tyreek was incredible last year. I know that they obviously wanted him to get 2,000, and he got hurt and wasn't even on pace for it towards the end of the year because of Miami not playing not playing well in tough matchups against tough teams. So I would imagine that receiving core will be better than it was last year. I think another year with Tua getting more comfortable, hopefully Tua becomes more consistent, because if Tua becomes more consistent, then you're looking at a juggernaut of a receiving core. I do think that Tua will be better than he was last year. For as much as I say that I'm out on him, I just don't want to take the risk. I think there's plenty of other quarterbacks that you can get that are in that same range of players that offer a safer floor. Maybe not the same upside, because Miami is obviously an elite offense. But I would say that as a whole, if I was ranking them based on a team tier perspective, where I thought that the teams were going to end up, this would be a much different conversation. But from a overall offense and a fantasy offense that I want to draft, I would say they're right up there with the Chiefs and the Bengals. And now the Chargers. What an offseason for the Chargers, and I don't mean that positively. You lose Keenan Allen, who, for the better part of the last 13 years, has been your heart and soul of your entire team. The last of the San Diego era. You trade him away for a 4th-round pick. I get it. You were over the cap. You needed to make moves. He wasn't willing to budge, so you had to do it. The problem is that you also lost Mike Williams, who, for everything that he hasn't done in the NFL, is still a great, talented player. Coming out of Clemson, he was my favorite receiver in that class. You look at the size, you look at the ball tracking ability, you look at the freakish athleticism. The only downside with Mike, obviously, is the fact that every time he makes a big play, he gets hurt, it seems like. So if he can maybe learn to land after grabbing the ball, maybe that would be a helpful thing for him. But you lost your 2 number 1 receivers. And on top of that, you also lost Austin Eckler, who, for as much as Austin Eckler didn't have the season that you would expect out of him where he was drafted and where he has been the past couple years, he was still, in my opinion, a better option from a fantasy perspective than what Gus Edwards will be this season. I know with Harbaugh, he wants to run the ball, he wants to run power, he wants to control the game in the time of possession category. But I don't think Gus Edwards is going to be somebody that you're going to be excited to be drafting on your fantasy team. I think he's going to be a lot more similar to the goal line role that he had, and that's where you're going to see your value. He might get 15 carries a game, but those 15 carries are probably going to be for 55 yards, and you better hope that he falls into the end zone. He doesn't offer anything in the receiving game. So you're going from having Austin Eckler, who was one of the most explosive dual threat running backs from a receiving and rushing category, to somebody that offers you nothing in the pass game and is very, very touchdown reliant. Quentin Johnston, in my opinion, is not somebody that you can count on. He's not somebody that you can really build your team right now and say, okay, he's going to be our number one receiver and we're going to be fine at that position. He had way too many drops last year. He obviously is a great route runner and he's a big body. But the problem is when you complete the catch, you either need to have the ball in your hands or keep 2 feet in bounds. And he showed multiple times last year that he couldn't multitask and do both of it. So I know it's his first year last year. Obviously, you would expect for him to take a leap forward, but I don't imagine it's going to be a leap forward enough for him to be a true number one receiver. This is a team that I would imagine will address it in the draft class, but because this is a pre-draft analysis of these teams, I am not going to give them the benefit of the doubt on that. And with all that being said, as much as I know that Justin Herbert is a top 8 to 10 quarterback in the league, I don't think he has the ability that someone like Pat Mahomes does to have a bare bones receiving core and still produce for fantasy. Especially when you look at who his new head coach and play caller are, and they want to run the ball, they want to control the game, and they don't really want to get into shootouts. And the problem is that defense is not good enough to stop a shootout. So it'll be interesting to see from a team perspective. Although I still think Herbert is a very quality player, I'm going to have to give the Chargers a D in their pre-draft fantasy offense ranking. Now the Steelers. The Steelers, to me, are an interesting team. I think they're kind of a hard one to rank. You know, if you look at what Russ did in Denver and you look at what Justin Fields did in Chicago, you can obviously see some bright spots and you can see some glaring weaknesses. Compared to what they had last season, they're obviously getting an improvement no matter which one of those two quarterbacks start. Trubisky, Pickett, Rudolph, none of those guys were viable options to keep an offense afloat. The fact that they won 10 games last year, or I think 9-8 or 10-7, one of the two, regardless, that was nothing short of a miracle coaching job by Mike Tomlin. And I don't think Mike Tomlin gets enough credit for being able to handle, you know, the type of team that they were last year and still get them over the hump. So no matter who's at quarterback of the two, either one of them will produce more fantasy value for those teams. When you look at the running backs, I'm still a big Najee fan. I think when I was watching games, I felt like the run blocking was very poor last year when Najee was on the field. I think Najee obviously has lost a step of explosiveness relative to his rookie year, but I don't think it's necessarily a lack of talent. I think it's obviously the offensive coordinator changes should help with that. I think Arthur Smith obviously wants to run the ball and wants to run the ball well. So I would imagine that Najee is going to have a much bigger role in the run game and be more productive from an efficiency standpoint. Warren is still a very, very good back. I would imagine that it'll probably be a split backfield, just like it was last year. But with Warren, he obviously offers you more in the pass game than what Najee does. And I think that's good for his value, because if it was just off of his rushing value alone, you really have to hope that Warren's going to break that 60-yard play that he did fairly consistently last year. Not saying that he couldn't, but there were a lot of negative run yards and a lot of negative rush yard plays with Jaylen Warren last year. There were a lot of plays where it just didn't work out the way that they schemed it. So having somebody that is obviously a very run game oriented play caller, I think will help both of their value. And I think both of them can still share that workload and give you that mid-range RB2 to flex option and flex appeal. When you're looking at the receiving core, they obviously traded Deontay Johnson away, which to me, Deontay is a great player. I think he obviously struggles with drops and he tends to run backwards when he catches the ball. So I think he's going to be a big part of the offense that is missed now. He obviously wasn't a big touchdown producer. He only had a few touchdowns over the last 2 years and went a full season without even scoring one. But I do think he is still going to be a valuable piece of the offense that is missed. I think if you look at George Pickens to me is, if you looked at just his highlights, he's the best wide receiver I've ever seen. But you think about what he does outside of those highlight plays, and it's very minimal. He'll give you an amazing circus catch for 60 yards, or he'll take an 80-yard catch to the house off a screen pass, but then he'll get you seven catches for 40 yards outside of that. So I don't think Pickens is going to be somebody that you can rely on weekly. If you look at what Russ did with Cortland Sutton last year, a lot of Cortland Sutton's production came from touchdowns. So if you're telling me that George Pickens is going to have 7 to 10 touchdowns, then yeah, I think he's going to provide great value. But if you're telling me that you think he's going to be a 1,200-yard receiver, I have a hard time believing in that. And then obviously at tight end, they still have Freiermuth. They drafted Darnell Washington last year. So they have guys at tight end, but I wouldn't say that they're anything above average. So for me, right now, I would say that the Steelers, with all average things being considered, I would say that they're right smack dab in the middle of being an average fantasy offense to be a part of. Now with the Ravens. The Ravens, to me, have an elite option in the run game in Derrick Henry. They have an elite option in the run game with Lamar Jackson. They have an elite tight end in Mark Andrews. And nothing else that I would feel very confident about on a weekly basis. Zay Flowers showed flashes last year. I think he will improve. I think he's kind of that Hollywood Brown replacement, but he does things a little bit differently. So he's not as much of a deep threat, but he is very good at the line of scrimmage. He's very good at yak. I would say that Rashad Bateman, for as much as I liked him coming out of Minnesota, I think he hasn't really produced at the level that I would have hoped for and would have expected. So it's kind of tough. Lamar can get you 40, but then he can also get you 16. So not saying that 16 is bad from a starting quarterback, but it just shows the wide gap. With last year there were multiple games where Gus Edwards would have 3 rushing touchdowns, and it shows how unselfish Lamar is as a player. And I commend him, and, that's not a bad thing by any means. But I think with Lamar's fantasy value, it's tied to his legs. It's tied to his ability to score touchdowns on both the ground and through the air. And if Derrick Henry is there, and Derrick Henry becomes the true goal line back, becomes the true workhorse back, if Derrick Henry's getting 20 carries a game, Lamar's probably going to have somewhere between 7 and 10. Which, on those 7 or 10, Lamar could still get you 70, 80 yards. So I'm not saying that he's not going to be a productive rusher anymore just because they have a Derrick Henry. But I do think that Lamar's rushing upside could be capped. Granted, it also could be exploding because of the read option game. If you're running RPOs with, Derrick Henry and then instead throwing the slant to, a Zay Flowers, then I think that obviously is going to throw defenses off. I think when you look at the read option game with him and Derrick Henry, if you're a D lineman and a linebacker, who are you going to crash into? Are you going to play the run with Henry, or are you going to hope that Lamar doesn't hold on to it and bust one loose? So I think that they still have a lot of value, but I do think it's very top heavy. So for me, I still think the Ravens are going to be in that A category. I would put them right up there with Buffalo because they have elite running quarterback options. They have, obviously, a 2-time MVP in Lamar. They both have a good number 1 playmaker on their team. For the Bills, it's Stephon Diggs. For the Ravens, I would say it's Derrick Henry, who I would imagine has at least another year of elite production in the tank. Derrick Henry, to me, is a mid-RB1. I might be a little high on him right now, just because of me fantasizing what he's going to be able to do in that Ravens offense. But overall, I think the Ravens have a good enough quality offense to produce at a high level. It's just going to be a few guys that do it. They're not going to be spreading it around. With the Titans, I think it's a little bit different. I think it will be much more spread around. When you look at their receiving core and you look at their running back room, they have multiple guys that do things similarly. Starting with the running backs, Tajay and Tony Pollard have very similar body types, very similar pass catching ability, very similar play styles. Neither one of them is going to be an in-between the tackles runner on a consistent basis to get you those tough yards. I think if you're looking at it from what they had in Derrick Henry to what they have now, it's obviously a totally different style of back, and it's going to be a totally different style of run game. Brian Callahan from the Bengals is now the head coach. And if you look at what the Bengals did, the Bengals never really had a true downhill runner. Joe Mixon is somebody that rushed a little more on the outsides, had great receiving back abilities. I don't think Joe Mixon was as good of a receiver as what Tajay is or as what Tony Pollard are. But I do think that they want to be able to get the ball in their running back's hands in a multitude of ways. So they're obviously not going to be, pushing through the middle as much. But I think that's where, when you have a big mobile quarterback like a Will Levis, I think you're going to have a little bit more of the QE draws on that side, just because, Will Levis is essentially the same size as Derrick Henry, so it's one of those things that if you're needing somebody to go through the middle, I think that's going to be a good option for him. When you look at the receiving core, D-Hop obviously still has some tread on those tires. They just signed Calvin Ridley to a huge deal. They still have the receiver that they traded A.J. Brown away for in, what's his name? Can't think of it right now, but that just shows that he has not had Burks. Treylon Burks. It just shows that he hasn't had the production that you would have assumed, out of a first round receiver going into year 3. So definitely not AJ Brown level, not worth that trade, especially to end up signing Calvin Ridley to essentially a slightly cheaper deal for a slightly older player. I think Calvin Ridley going to an offense that wants to stretch the ball deep. Last year in Jacksonville, he had a lot of opportunities. It's not to say that he didn't, but there were also multiple games where Calvin Ridley would have 1 target in the first half, or no targets in the first half, and then they would give him 7 or 8 targets in the second half. So if you just hope to see Tennessee be a little bit more, I would say, specific with how they use Calvin Ridley, I think Calvin Ridley could still have good upside. I think he could still be a mid-tier wide receiver 2 with the potential to be a high-end wide receiver 2. And same with DeAndre Hopkins. Obviously, they play a little bit different of a style, but I think for the most part, having 2 solid options for Will Levis is probably more beneficial than having 1 great option and 1 not so great option. So I think when you look at Will Levis's strategy as a fantasy player, or if you're looking at it from drafting Will Levis, what you're expecting out of Will Levis showed me a lot more than I expected last year. I think he obviously is not afraid to take shots deep downfield, which will help both DeAndre Hopkins and Calvin Ridley's value. I think because of that too, though, it also might hurt, the running backs in terms of the pass game, unless they're going to be throwing screens. Will Levis isn't afraid to throw it deep, so he's not going to be checking down somebody like a Derek Carr would be. So Will Levis to me is a very polarizing player. Not sure where to really rank him yet. As a late round flyer, I would love to get some shares of Will Levis just to see, what he produces or how he produces, because I do think that offense, while it is a lot of the same stuff, with the running backs and the receivers being all fairly similar in scheme and talent, I do think that they will have enough pieces around him to be able to build a functioning offense. But with that said, I still don't think they're going to be an elite option, so I would put them right up there with the Steelers and the Jags. Now for the Browns. I think Amari Cooper might be the most underrated wide receiver of the last 6 or 7 years. It doesn't matter the quarterbacks he's playing with. He still produces. but yet no team really wants to build their team around him. He's still young. He's a great route runner. He does have a tendency to fall out of the game script at times, and he's probably the farthest thing from a diva wide receiver you could possibly have. He's very, I don't want to say monotone, but he's very stable. He doesn't have the peaks, he doesn't have the lows. He's just kind of himself. So I think Amari Cooper is obviously a great receiver. They traded for Jerry Jeudy. They traded for Elijah Moore last year. That receiving core could be really, really good. If you look at the running game, obviously there's a huge question mark with Nick Chubb. Whether or not he comes back fully healthy week 1, or if they're going to use Jerome Ford, and they just signed Donta Foreman, if they're going to be using a running back by committee until he can get back healthy, and obviously what he's going to look like when he does come back healthy. I think if you look at the name value of Nick Chubb and you know what he's been through when he was at Georgia, I'm not going to be the one to doubt Nick Chubb. I'm not going to be the one to say that Nick Chubb can't come back off of a knee injury, especially when it wasn't as bad as what they initially thought based on the play that we watched in Pittsburgh that night. So a lot of it is going to rely on that. How much of a power run game can they have? How much of the run game is going to go through Nick Chubb, and how much of it is going to go through those other two guys that I mentioned. I think early in the season, you'll probably see, even if Nick Chubb is playing week 1, I would imagine that you're going to be seeing a lot more Jerome Ford and Donta Foreman early in the season. And then as Nick Chubb gets more comfortable, similar to what Breece Hall went through last year, where he was on more of a pitch count to start, and then as the season progressed and they really felt confident about the knee, really getting him more touches and getting him more opportunities, becoming that bell cow again. That's kind of how I would project Nick Chubb. Obviously, Nick Chubb is not as young as Breece Hall, but if you're talking about somebody that can be just as, I guess, bounce back-ish, I'm not going to be the one to doubt Nick Chubb. And then at tight end, they have David Njoku. And David Njoku was somebody that I really liked coming out. And for the first couple years, he dealt with injuries. He dealt with not really being consistent on the field. And this past year, he finally put it all together. And I think that was big. Obviously with Flacco is where he was really producing the majority of his points. Once Flacco came in, the fact that the Browns were as good as they were last year with the amount of quarterbacks that were playing for them. Obviously, Deshaun Watson was a shell of himself last year with his shoulder injury. DTR came in, didn't play great. You had Joe Flacco, who you signed off the couch just to be able to get you, that playoff push. And then I believe they even started another quarterback at one point. So, to have that kind of inconsistency at the most crucial position where the majority of your playmakers are, required to go from. The quarterback is the one that takes them to the promised land. So I think when you're looking at that, the fact that Njoku was finally able to produce with kind of a hodgepodge of a quarterback room was very encouraging to me. I think if Deshaun Watson can come back healthy and he can even be just 60% of what he was in Houston, I think you really have to look at the Browns as a Super Bowl contender, like a true Super Bowl contender. Obviously, they lost in the first round this past year to the Texans, and I would say a lot of that was probably on Joe Flacco. For as much as Joe Flacco was great in the ending of the regular season, he was not so great in the postseason game that they played. So I would say with all of that being considered, all of the potential that they have on that team, a lot of it relies on the run game, and a lot of it will rely on Nick Chubb and his health. I will say that the Browns are going to be the first of the B tier, just because I think that they could have that elite upside as an offense, like the Ravens have or like the Bills have. But I don't know that yet, just because of the health of Nick Chubb. Because if Nick Chubb's healthy, he's an RB1. That's maybe the easiest one to pencil in. If Nick Chubb plays 17 games and is healthy week 1, I think it was week 4 that he got hurt, so he'll have almost a full year to get ready. I don't think that they have the elite upside of the Bengals, the Chiefs, the Dolphins, but I know for a fact that they have a higher floor than what the Jags, the Steelers, and the Titans do. Now moving on to the team that they lost to in the playoffs, the Houston Texans. When you look at the Texans, nobody in their right mind would have said that they thought that the Texans were going to do what they did. I was a big CJ Stroud fan coming out, but even I'm shocked by how productive CJ Stroud actually was. If you look at that receiving core, they obviously have young studs across it. Tank Dell, Nico Collins. I was a big fan of John Mechie coming out of Alabama. Somebody that can really stretch the field and somebody that can really produce at a high level. He obviously hasn't had the start to his NFL career, with his first rookie season being, non-existent because of his leukemia. And then, moving into this year, he obviously was playing in a crowded receiving room with really talented players and just never really saw the field. So maybe that's a learning curve. Maybe that's him getting back to full health. Maybe he takes a step forward. Maybe he doesn't. But even if he doesn't, Nico Collins and Tank Dell are still probably the most exciting young duo that I can think of in the NFL right now from a, less than 3 years of experience standpoint. Nico Collins, even when Tank Dell wasn't on the field after week 13, looked like he could handle the wide receiver one output no problem. So when you look at those two receiving options and you look at the fact that they re-signed Dalton Schultz, who's a reliable tight end, he's a streamer at best, but I don't think, maybe not at best. I would say he's more in that streamer category than a weekly starter, but he is talented enough to where if tight end is a thin, tight end's always a thin position. So if you're looking at somebody like Dalton Schultz as your weekly starter, you probably could do worse, but you could definitely do better. So if you look at the weapons around him, you look at the fact that they traded for Joe Mixon. I think Joe Mixon's obviously going to be a massive upgrade over what they were getting out of Devin Singletary last year. So I think that was the most underrated trade of the offseason, in my opinion. And you would just imagine that CJ Stroud is going to take another step forward. I think that the Houston Texans, as much as it is really weird to say, I think the Houston Texans are going to be that team to beat in the AFC South for the better part of the next few years, unless Anthony Richardson really becomes what I think he can become, which that will be, something that we talk about in 2 slides. But for me right now, I would say that the Texans have the same type of upside as the Bills and the Ravens offenses do. When you look at the weapons that they have, when you imagine that CJ Stroud is only going to get more comfortable this upcoming season, you look at the fact that he didn't even have Tank Dell after week 13, and he was still producing at a high level. Their running game got better. Their offensive line is going to get better. I think overall, the Texans are going to be a scary team and a team that I want as many pieces of on offense as that I can draft. All right, we're down to the final 4. Going with the Broncos. The Broncos obviously right now have a massive hole at quarterback. Jared Stidham is currently the projected starter. You would imagine that will change, whether they sign a free agent type of quarterback like a Carson Wentz, or they end up drafting somebody. Either way, they don't have one right now. They don't have anybody that I would feel confident in. So, massive hole. I still like Javonte Williams a lot. I think him coming off of his knee injury last year that was a little more severe than what Breece's was, I think another year with that out of the way, I think he will look more to form than what we saw his rookie year. And I really like Jaleel McLaughlin too. I think he's a better receiving back than what Javonte is. And if you look at what Sean Payton's done in the past with multiple running backs, not saying that he's on the level of that either one of these guys are on the level of what Alvin Kamara and Mark Ingram were, or Pierre Thomas and Darren Sproles were, but he always likes to shuffle in multiple backs. And to me, I think Jaleel McLaughlin is going to have more of that Darren Sproles role, where he's going to be much more of a receiving option than a rushing option. But in fantasy, especially in PPR leagues, we value and covet that. So having somebody in the receiving game that is going to be getting volume at running back is absolutely huge for a depth pick. I'm not drafting Jaleel as a starter, but he's definitely a stash. Javonte, I would draft as a starter. I think he's a mid-tier RB2 right now with the potential of that offense. It's, it's somewhat shaky. He might be a flex option, because if they can't pass the ball, they're just going to load the box and Javonte's not going to have a rushing hole to go through. So I think he's kind of a polarizing player in the way that he has a high ceiling but a low floor. But at this point, I still like Javonte enough to consider him as an RB2, at least for the time being. When you look at the receiving core, the player I'm most excited for is Marvin Mims. I read a lot of reports saying that the reason why Marvin Mims didn't see the field as much is because him and Jerry Jeudy played that same role in the offense. So now that Jerry Jeudy's gone, that obviously opens up a spot for Marvin Mims. And if Marvin Mims can actually produce, I think that'll be something that Jerry Jeudy just never could. When you look at Courtland Sutton is somebody that I'm extremely skeptical about. He had a great season last year, but it was mainly because of the touchdowns. And if you remember looking back at those touchdowns, a lot of those were circus-type plays that are not something that is sustainable over the course of a season. Obviously it was last year, but I wouldn't double down on that and think that it's going to be the same. So, without having a quarterback, without having a true number one receiver that can do it in a variety of ways, and just the overall question marks on that offense right now, the Broncos, to me, are right next to their AFC West counterpart in the Chargers as a very, very bad offense at this moment, that there's maybe one guy on that entire team that I'd be willing to draft. Now we're talking about the Colts. For me, Anthony Richardson was my favorite prospect coming out of last year's draft. Not only was he a freak athlete, he's just a dude I believe in. He has all the ability, he's humble, he wants to learn, he wants to grow. I am extremely excited for his future in the NFL and extremely excited to watch him on Sundays. It was obviously a mixed bag for him this past year because when he was on the field, he was getting you 20 points and a half. He was showing you that elite fantasy production that you were looking for out of a mobile quarterback, especially as a rookie. But at the same point, he was also showing you that because of that rushing ability, he was also going to have a much higher potential of getting hurt. And he missed games while he was playing. He missed halves while he was playing. And then he ended up missing the entire rest of the season after I believe it was week 5 or week 6. So if he can be healthy and if he can be the player that we saw, I think he could be the quarterback 1 for the next 10 years. Maybe not 10 years, probably closer to like 4 or 5, just because of the way he plays. But I think he was a much more polished passer than a lot of scouts gave him credit for. I think he obviously has the elite athleticism and the ability to really shine at the quarterback position. And I think he has a great head on his shoulders. So that to me is somebody that I want as many pieces of as possible. Injuries are commonplace in the NFL. It's not something that you ever can say they're not going to happen. So they're a risk with any player. It doesn't matter if you're a pocket passer or a mobile quarterback. So I don't ever want to hold the fact that somebody got injured before against them unless it ends up being a massive pattern. Somebody like a J.K. Dobbins, unfortunately. Not saying anything against him as a player, but because of the fact that he just couldn't stay on the field. When you look at their running back in Jonathan Taylor, you obviously had the holdout in the beginning of the season, and then you obviously had a little bit of an injury at the very end of the season where he was missing time and Zach Moss was getting in there. But I think the excitement about Jonathan Taylor is the fact that we've seen him produce at such a high level that he's going to be somebody that I want on my fantasy teams. I have him as a fringe top 5 running back right now in redraft leagues. And I think he's still young enough, he still has enough tread on those tires, and I think he's still hungry enough, even after getting paid, to really show why he is that dude. If you look at their receiving core, they re-signed Michael Pittman, they still have Alec Pierce, and they still have Josh Downs, who they drafted last year. I think if you're looking at the most underrated receiving group I would say that the Colts have the most underrated receiving group. Michael Pittman is not a star by any means, but he is one hell of a player. Alec Pierce is not a household name, nor will he probably ever be, but he is a really, really good receiver. Josh Downs is not going to be somebody that is, making you say wow a lot. He's a great option. He has a great route running. He's not physical, or not as physical as somebody like a Michael Pittman is. He's obviously a much smaller frame, but I think that he has the elite receiving option, or maybe not elite. He has a really good possibility of being a good receiver. So when you look at the weapons around them, they have 3 standout receivers in my opinion. I think all 3 of them are worthy of taking in a fantasy draft. I think they're all really good stashes because I think they're going to be undervalued at ADP just because of the question marks about Anthony Richardson. But I do think that they will all outperform their ADP, wherever that is. So for me, the Colts as an offense, I believe in enough to put them right where the Browns are. It's a lot of potential. It's a lot of talking about how, if things work the right way. But both of those teams, in my opinion, have the ability to make it work the right way. All right, and now we got the Raiders. So this is my favorite NFL team. This is, the team that I live and breathe for better or worse. And right now, because I'm doing this draft, or I'm doing this pre-draft, I have to look at it for the worst side of things. I think Minshew is a quality NFL player. I think he's much closer to being a backup than a star. But I do think that when you look at our offense from last year and how porous it was at times, against the Vikings, we literally couldn't score a point. If you look at the game against the Chiefs on Christmas, we didn't complete a pass after the first quarter. So that means the entire second, third, and fourth quarters, we did not complete a pass. I don't think we're going to be that bad this year. You can't be that bad again. I don't think that Minshew is going to be somebody that I'm going to be drafting as a starting quarterback unless I'm, just taking a homer pick late in the draft just to see. Same with Aiden O'Connell. Aiden O'Connell showed that he can go through adversity and be a quality-ish option. I wasn't overly impressed by his play, but I was impressed with the way that he handled himself, the way that he came to work every day, and the fact that, Josh McDaniels got fired at the beginning of the season, obviously changing over to an offensive coordinator that in Bo Hardegree that had never called plays at any level before. So I think that when you look at those things, he obviously was not in a very fortunate position, but he still handled it with class. Obviously, Antonio Pierce still believes in him. I still believe in him, but I don't believe in him in the way that I want him on my fantasy team, nor do I want him to be producing for or be the quarterback throwing balls to the guys that are on my fantasy team. So I would project that the Raiders will be getting a quarterback at some point in the draft, whether we trade up for Jaden Daniels or we end up taking someone like Michael Penix. But at this point, I cannot project that. So I'm going off of the fact that we have Minshew and that we have Aiden O'Connell. When you look at our running back situation, obviously we lost Josh Jacobs, who is a key component to our offense. But when you look at somebody like Zamir Zeus White, he is an underrated runner who has never gotten the opportunity to really show what he can do. The dude is strong, like strong. I think he's going to be somebody that we can rely on and give a true opportunity to. I still think that we would draft a running back. I know that we signed Alexander Madison. We re-signed Amir Abdullah. So we do have some running backs in the room already that could get touches. But I do think that based on the way that they use Zamir at the end of the season, it is encouraging to say that he will be the starting running back for the Raiders. The last 4 games of the year after Josh Jacobs got hurt, Zamir scored 16, 14.5, 13.1, and 12.6 in half-point PPR. Those are starting running back numbers. Whether he's starting as your flex or he's starting as your RB2, either way, you're getting quality production out of him in those last 4 games. I would imagine with Luke Getsy as our offensive coordinator now, will have a much more polished game plan. I would imagine even if it is Minshew under center, I think Minshew's a big enough upgrade over AOC that we will be in a better position as an offense. So I do believe in Zamir White moving forward. So he is somebody that I would like to draft, not even just as a Raider fan, but as a fantasy fan. I'm not taking him in the first 3 rounds, but if you're going for like a 0 RB or a hero RB build, Zamir White is definitely somebody that I could see as a quality performer at ADP or even below ADP, just because there are going to be people that don't have the Raiders anywhere near as high as I do. I think he's a quality option. When you look at our receiving core and our tight end room, Devontae is still that dude. I know he's getting a little older, and I know there were a lot of trade speculations between, funny enough, the last 2 teams that are on the board. But I still think Devontae is a high-level wide receiver. He might not get you the top 3 wide receiver numbers that he was getting you when he was in Green Bay anymore, or even have the year that he had when he had Derek 2 years ago. But either way, Devontae is still probably going to get you 1,200 yards and double-digit touchdowns. That, to me, is a guy that I want on my team. If he's going to be getting 10, 12 targets a game, and our pass game is better because we're not missing passes for 3 straight quarters, I think he's going to be an elite option still. In Dynasty, I wouldn't take him anywhere near as high just because he is getting older. He's 31 now. I think if you're looking at it from a 1 year, like a redraft league, he's definitely somebody I want on my team. Probably taking him in the late 2nd, early 3rd, just because of where his ADP will fall. A lot of people probably won't be reaching as high on Devontae. But if you look at what Devontae can do and has done, it doesn't matter who his quarterback is. It doesn't matter how bad the offense is. He is still that dude. When you look at Jacoby Myers is a great compliment to him. Jacoby is a physical player. He is somebody that works in space really well. He showed you that he was a red zone threat for us last year. So Jacoby to me is a great flex option and depth pickup. And then Trey Tucker is the ultimate lottery ticket in my opinion. Because if we get a quarterback like a Jaden Daniels that could stretch the field, then you have somebody that can just run a 9 route all day and get behind the defense. Once again, not projecting us to get Jaden right now. Using Minshew as our starting quarterback, Trey Tucker doesn't have as much of an elite upside just because Minshew doesn't stretch the field anywhere near as much as some of these other quarterbacks do. But Trey Tucker does have that game-breaking speed and that game-breaking ability for him to be somebody that I would target, especially in a dynasty league or in a keeper league, as somebody to stash and wait on. When you look at Michael Mayer, I think Michael Mayer was my favorite tight end prospect coming out, even before the Raiders drafted him. I liked him. Obviously, nobody knew what Sam Laporta was going to do, and I know Dalton Kincaid obviously had a lot of hype around him, but Michael Mayer to me had the best ability as a physical tight end, as a receiving option. He's obviously a big dude, so he can work in space really well. And the run after catch with Michael Mayer was huge. So regardless of who his quarterback is going to be, if you look at what Luke Getsy did in Chicago in the way that he really highlighted Cole Kmet, I would imagine that you're going to have at least that kind of production out of Michael Mayer going into year 2. With all that being said, the Raiders right now to me are a middle-of-the-pack offensive team. I would take them over the Titans and the Steelers. I would probably put them right behind the Jags, though. Because if I'm looking at the running backs, ETN to me is still a better running back than Zamir White. Receiving option-wise, I like, obviously, having Devontae more than I like having Christian Kirk. But the quarterback position is the biggest issue there for me. And finally, we come to the most talked about team of the offseason last year, the New York Jets. The New York Jets are going to be a much different team this year than they were last year. Obviously, when you're looking at Aaron Rodgers only playing 4 snaps last year compared to hopefully getting a full 17-game season out of him this year, the receiving numbers and the offense in general is going to be much different. When you had Zach Wilson under center, the teams could stack the box. They didn't have to worry about, Garrett Wilson really getting loose and getting deep. They didn't really have to worry about the pass rush not getting home because that offensive line was so porous. So this year, they've already signed Tyron Smith. They made a trade for, I believe it was Morgan Moses from Baltimore. So they're already addressing the offensive line. They still have Elijah Vera Tucker, who's a really good offensive lineman. And I think that's going to obviously help pass protection and run blocking and creating those holes for who I believe is the overall RB1 going into this season in Breece Hall. Breece Hall came off of an ACL injury, and to me, didn't look like he missed a step, which is wild. Like, he is such a freak athlete. He is obviously so elusive. You've seen that first game against Buffalo. He had a long touchdown. He had an 80-yard touchdown ready to go, and it was conditioning that stopped him. He's an elite one-cut runner. He doesn't need a whole lot of space to make it happen. He's got a brutal stiff arm, not like a Najee stiff arm, but he's got a good stiff arm. He's extremely elusive, amazing pass catching ability. You saw I don't remember the game against or who they were playing, but I believe he had 20 targets in a game last season, if I'm not mistaken. So Breece Hall to me is the overall RB1 behind that offensive line. Give him Aaron Rodgers as a quarterback, and those lanes are going to open up like crazy. They're not going to be able to stack the box because the Jets just signed Mike Williams, and they still have Garrett Wilson. You also have Allen Lazard, who's 6'5", great red zone option. So you have two guys that are 6'4" or taller, and you have Garrett Wilson, who, in most people's opinion, is the best up-and-coming receiver, going into his third year now. He was Offensive Rookie of the Year 2 years ago. Obviously, playing with, piss-poor quarterback play is tough for a receiver, especially when you're so reliant on that position being good. And then, obviously, the emotional drop-off from thinking you had Aaron Rodgers, 4-time MVP, Super Bowl champion, to Zach Wilson. So, I think when you look at the Jets' offense, they're going to look so much different this year. Aaron Rodgers has weapons in Garrett Wilson. If Mike Williams comes back healthy, he's going to be a stud. Allen Lazard didn't play well last year and definitely didn't play up to that contract that he got. But the expectation was that he was going to be playing with Aaron Rodgers like he did in Green Bay, not playing with Zach Wilson. So I would imagine that Aaron Rodgers is going to be able to do more with Allen Lazard. And I would imagine that Matt Hackett will scheme up ways to use Allen Lazard to what Rodgers wants to do rather than what they were doing with Zach Wilson. So, considering they have the overall RB1 in my opinion, they have an elite wide receiver in Garrett Wilson, who is a wide receiver 1, especially with Rodgers coming back. They have a really, really high-end wide receiver 2 option in Mike Williams now. The offensive line got better. Aaron Rodgers, to me, is a mid to low-end QB1. In Superflex leagues, I would take him as a starting quarterback option for sure. And in redraft leagues, it would just depend on where his ADP goes. But overall, I would say that the Jets are going to be a very good offense, but not an elite offense just yet. I would like to see what Rodgers actually looks like with the team. I would actually put them in front of the Browns. There we go. I would put them at the high end of the B tier. I wouldn't say that they're on the tier with the Texans or the Ravens or the Bills just yet. Obviously, having the RB1 has a lot of weight to that. So that's where I would say that they're on the fringe of it. But overall, I think that they're going to have a much better offense than we saw last year. All right, guys. So that was my AFC. We're going to be calling this segment the roster rundown. So this was our roster rundown for the AFC pre-draft with no expectation of making any draft picks. I wouldn't have the Chargers at a D tier if they were drafting a Malik Neighbors or a Marvin Harrison. I wouldn't be having the Patriots as an F if they take Jaden Daniels. There are going to be guys that obviously impact where these teams would rank otherwise. But for the most part, I would say that this is my pre-draft tier list. So appreciate you guys for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. You can follow me on Twitter at Alex_LegacyFB and on our Legacy Football Twitter account at DraftYourLegacy. You can also sign up for email alerts on our LegacyFootball.com website so that you can stay up to the know about any content that we're going to be releasing, as well as the progress on the platform development. I'm super excited to be able to share, my opinions with you guys, but I'm even more excited to share the actual platform once we get closer to launch. We're still in development right now, but I can tell you this, the platform looks incredible. I am so excited to be launching this year and to be able to share what I've built with the rest of the fantasy community. So if you want to support somebody like myself who obviously is trying to create something for the greater good of the fantasy community, give everybody a better overall fantasy experience, please comment, please like, please reach out to me, please, do whatever is in your heart to help this thing grow. So once again, guys, my name's Alex, and I want to say thank you for watching, listening, and paying attention. See you next time.